Welcome to Talk Wave, making waves, one talk at a time.
Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling something, a topic that's pretty hot right now. Gender ideology and the whole idea of objective truth.
Yeah, this is a big one for sure.
Yeah, it is. And we got some interesting sources to unpack today.
Yeah, we do.
We've got this excerpt from a commentary for the Heritage Foundation called What is Gender Ideology? By Jay Richards.
Okay.
So we're getting right into it there. Then we've got a neutral explainer we found that kind of brings in some of the scientific and medical stuff.
Yeah, that's helpful for context.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And to spice things up a bit, we'll be listening to some clips from a pretty fiery Candace Owens interview on the Council Culture show.
I can't wait to hear what she has to say about this.
Oh, it's intense. So even though our sources come from different perspectives, they're all kind of wrestling with the same basic questions, like, what even is gender ideology? And how does it challenge, like, the whole concept of objective truth? Especially when we're talking about biological sex and gender identity, right?
Exactly. Those are really the core issues at play here, and those questions come up no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on.
That's so true. And it's so easy to get lost in the weeds with this topic, you know? The language can be confusing and people get really passionate really quickly.
Yeah, it's definitely a minefield out there.
Yeah, it is. But remember, our goal here isn't to, like, pick a side or decide who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah.
We just want to give you the information you need to understand this whole landscape and make up your own mind.
Right. It's all about providing context and helping our listeners navigate these complex ideas.
Totally. So let's jump right in. Why don't we start with how the Heritage Foundation piece actually defines this whole gender ideology thing?
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
So they say that gender ideology is the view that the sex binary doesn't capture the complexity of the human species,
Okay.
and that human individuals are properly described in terms of an internal sense of gender called gender identity that may be incongruent with their sex assigned at birth.
Whoa, okay, there's a lot packed into that definition. Like, we've got sex binary, internal sense of gender, sex assigned at birth.
Right. It's almost like a whole new vocabulary.
It is. It's like learning a new language. And like you said, these terms are super important if we want to understand how gender ideology actually works, right?
Definitely. So the sex binary they're talking about, that refers to the traditional view of sex as strictly male or female,
Yeah.
based on biology.
Okay, so like what we learned in high school biology class.
Exactly. But gender ideology kind of pushes back against that binary. They argue that gender identity, which is how someone feels about their own gender inside, can be different from their sex assigned at birth. The sex that's determined by physical characteristics when they're born.
Oh, I see. So it's about this potential disconnect between what's considered biological and someone's internal experience of themselves.
Exactly.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, how does this all compare to a more, like, traditional biological perspective on sex?
Well, biologically speaking, sex is usually seen as, like, objectively determined by chromosomes, reproductive organs, hormone levels, that kind of thing.
Okay, so it's all about the physical stuff.
Right. So, like, someone with exochromosomes and a female reproductive system would typically be classified as biologically female.
Okay, that makes sense. But then even the term gender ideology itself is kind of controversial, isn't it?
Oh, definitely.
Like, the Heritage piece mentions that. And
Yeah.
we've even seen pushback from, like, the AP Style Guide and Wikipedia about using it.
Right. And that just goes to show you how loaded the language itself is in this whole debate.
Yeah, it's not just about the ideas, it's about the words we use to talk about them, too.
Exactly. Critics of the term argue that it's often used to, like, dismiss or discredit the experiences of transgender people. Like, it frames their existence as just some kind of made-up ideology instead of something based in reality.
Okay, so it's like you're saying their experiences aren't real because it's all just an ideology.
Yeah, and that's the problem. It's important to understand that different people have very different reactions to that term and how it's used.
It seems like right from the start, we're hitting this tension between the biological definition of sex and this idea of gender identity, which might not always match up.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, we have this whole other layer of how we even talk about these concepts. Like, some words just carry so much baggage with them.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Okay, well, that's a great starting point. Now things are going to get even more complex as we look into the arguments against this idea that, a man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's like a whole other can of worms.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And that's where Candace Owens comes in with a very strong perspective.
Okay, let's dive into that.
Let's do it. So one of the main arguments against that whole a man is a man and a woman is a woman thing comes from the existence of intersex people.
Oh, right. Yeah.
These are people who are born with variations in their sex characteristics
Sorry?
that don't fit neatly into the traditional male-female categories.
Yeah. That definitely makes things more complicated.
It does. It really challenges that idea that biological sex is always like super clear-cut and easy to determine.
And then, of course, we also have to consider the experiences of transgender individuals, right? People whose gender identity is different from the sex they were assigned at birth.
Exactly. And that further complicates the idea of gender as something purely defined by biology.
It's like there's this whole other layer of experience that doesn't necessarily line up with the physical stuff.
Right. And that's where Candace Owens' perspective from that YouTube interview gets really interesting.
Yes. She comes in with a very strong opinion.
She does.
She basically says, a woman cannot be a man cannot be a woman. That's not a belief. It's like she's drawing a line in the sand.
Yeah, she's not mincing words. And that statement really highlights this clash between individual feelings and what she sees as objective reality.
It's like, if biological sex is objectively determinable, like Owen says it is,
right,
how do we reconcile that with the experiences of transgender people who feel like their assigned sex doesn't match their gender identity?
That's the million-dollar question. And Owens doesn't shy away from that conflict at all. In fact, she uses a pretty controversial analogy to make her point.
Oh, yeah. This is where things get a little uncomfortable.
It does.
She brings up the whole minor attracted individual thing.
Right, which is a term a lot of people find deeply disturbing.
Yeah, for sure.
But she's using it very deliberately to kind of push buttons and make us think about the limits of respecting subjective beliefs.
It's like she's saying, if we have to accept and respect every single subjective identity, then logically we'd have to do the same for people who identify as minor attracted, which obviously has huge moral and legal implications.
Right, and that's where the analogy gets tricky.
For sure, because on the one hand, it's important to acknowledge that people have different experiences and beliefs.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we can't just ignore objective facts or the potential harm that certain beliefs might cause, especially when it comes to something as serious as, the well-being of children.
It's a tough one to balance, for sure.
It is. And it seems like Owens is more concerned with what she sees as truth, even if it's upsetting to some people.
Yeah, she doesn't seem too worried about hurting feelings.
Not at all.
Which is, its own kind of statement.
It is. It's like she's saying that sometimes the most compassionate thing to do is be blunt and honest, even if it's hard to hear.
Right, like sometimes we need to be shaken out of our delusions, even if it's painful.
But is there room for nuance here? Like, can we acknowledge objective truths and these subjective experiences without having to choose one or the other?
That's what we're trying to figure out, isn't it? Can we hold both of those ideas in our minds at the same time?
Yeah, it's like, can we acknowledge the biological reality of sex while also respecting the very real and often very difficult experiences of people whose gender identity doesn't align with that reality?
Exactly. And I think that's where empathy comes in.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because we're not just talking about abstract concepts here. We're talking about real human beings,
right,
with real feelings and experiences and struggles.
And we have to approach these conversations with that in mind, even when we disagree.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that these are complex issues with no easy answers.
Yeah, we need to get past these simplistic either frameworks and really embrace nuance and complexity.
Exactly.
And I think, maybe most importantly, we need to be humble.
Yes.
And realize that we all have more to learn and that we can actually learn from each other if we're willing to listen.
That's so important, especially in today's climate where these conversations tend to get so heated so quickly.
Yeah, it's like the stakes are so high
and
people are so afraid of saying the wrong thing that they just shut down completely.
And that's not helpful for anyone. We need to be able to have these conversations even when they're difficult, even when we disagree.
And, even though Candace Owens can be pretty provocative and even offensive sometimes,
oh, yeah, for sure,
she does force us to confront these uncomfortable questions.
She does. And whether we agree with her or not, she makes us think.
Yeah, and there's value in that.
Definitely. She shakes things up and forces us to examine our own assumptions.
She said something that really stuck with me. She said, compassion is telling the truth.
That's interesting.
And I'm not sure I completely agree with that, but it definitely makes you think.
It does.
Because is it always the most compassionate thing to be brutally honest, even if it hurts?
That's a really tough question. I mean, there are arguments on both sides, right?
Yeah.
Like some people would say that sugarcoating things or withholding the truth is actually harmful in the long run.
Right, like it's a form of enabling or something.
Exactly. But then others would say that true compassion means meeting people where they are
Right.
and validating their experiences, even if those experiences don't align with our own understanding of reality.
So it's about finding that balance, isn't it?
Right.
Between honesty and empathy.
Exactly. And recognizing that these conversations have real-world consequences.
Oh, for sure. This isn't just some abstract philosophical debate.
Right. These conversations affect people's lives.
They do. They influence policies. They influence how we interact with each other.
And how we understand gender and identity as a society.
Okay, so where does all of this leave us? We've talked about how gender ideology is defined, the challenges to objective truth, and the role of compassion in all of this.
Yeah, it's been a lot to unpack.
It really has. And like we said at the beginning, we didn't come into this trying to settle the debate or anything.
Right, exactly.
Our goal was to give you, the listener, the tools to think about this stuff for yourself. Understand the nuances, see where the different sides are coming from.
And hopefully encourage some critical thinking along the way.
Yes, because we're bombarded with so much information all the time, right? And so much of it is just like sound bites and slogans. But when it comes to these big, complex topics like gender identity and objective truth, we need to go deeper.
Yeah.
We need to question our assumptions, look at things from different angles.
Absolutely. And don't just take our word for it or Candace Owens' word for it or even the Heritage Foundation's. Go out there and do your own research, read different perspectives, listen to different voices.
Yeah, form your own opinions. And remember, how we understand these things, like gender and identity and even truth itself, it really shapes how we interact with the world, how we build relationships, how we create a society that works for everyone.
It does. It's all connected.
So as we wrap up our deep dive here, we want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay, shoot.
How does this whole concept of objective truth, or even the idea that it might not exist, how does that affect your understanding of gender, identity, the world around you?
That's a great question, and hopefully one that our listeners will spend some time thinking about.
Yeah, we hope so. Because the conversation doesn't end here. It's an ongoing process of learning and questioning and growing.
It really is.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah.
And keep those conversations going.